Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, Josh interviews Amba Guerguerian and Harry to discuss the New York War Crimes Project and their efforts to get people to boycott, divest, and unsubscribe from the New York Times. Amba Guerguerian is an associate editor at the Indypendent and a contributor at the New York War Crimes. Harry is a writer, educator, organizer with Writers Against the War on Gaza, and a contributor at the New York War Crimes as well. The New York War Crimes is a project dedicated to delegitimizing the imperial mouthpiece that is the New York Times through focused contemporary and historical critique, while providing an alternative platform for Palestinian and Arab authors, poets, and artists, precisely what you won't find in the pages of the Times. I really appreciated this conversation and the work that Amba, Harry, and others are doing with the New York War Crimes Project. I also want to say, if you're looking for more conversations like this, we have a live stream with Bryce Greene from Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and then we have discussed the media as a weapon of psychological warfare in our conversations with Dylan Rodriguez and Laura Shihai on the YouTube side. I also just recommend the work of Justin Podour at the Anti-Empire Project, Electronic Intifada, of course, Mondoweiss, and then just getting your news from outlets in the Middle East, even in Arabic, and just use the translate function to translate it to English as well. If you would like to support our work, the best way to do so, as always, is to become a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism. We are also still working to increase our subscriber base over on the YouTube channel, so subscribing to that feed is another great way to support our work. We have 4, possibly 5 live episodes coming this upcoming week, so make sure you are subscribed there or on Patreon to catch all of that content, including conversations with Abdul Jawad Omar, DJ Prashad, Kai Heron, Two Black, and Rasul Moab. So make sure you are subscribed there or on Patreon to catch all of that content.
Okay, so I would like to welcome both of you to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. I'm very excited to talk to you today as you've been involved in the culmination of some incredibly important research regarding the New York Times, as well as some action protesting one of the largest printing facilities in the country, which houses some of the major presses like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, US Today, and others. So we should start off by allowing you to introduce yourselves and the type of work that you are involved in, even outside of the specific project, and talk about what provoked your organization to embark on this project and the website that has recently been launched as a result of your findings.
Hi, thank you so much for having us on the show. Really happy to be here and to share more about this project. My name is Amba Guerguerian, and I work at an independent newspaper here in New York City called the Indypendent. So I'm very involved in local grassroots, sort of like non-mainstream and non-corporate journalism. And so that's, how I pulled into doing this project that we're really excited to talk about. So for this specific project that you're mentioning that this website was a part of, essentially through a branch of Writers Against the War on Gaza, which is a group of media and creatives that have come together after October 7th, in the wake of October 7th, to, protest and do direct action for Palestinian freedom, toward Palestinian freedom. So that group was already founded, had done some actions, and, some of different, members got together and wanted to continue to ramp up action against the New York Times. And the way that we did this was on March 14th, when we launched a 4-pronged action, and one of those blocking, which resulted in slowing down some of the drivers' routes for distribution of the Times. As you said, the center for 3 hours in the middle of the night. Post, USA Today printing there. And so we, stalled mainstream media that morning. Meanwhile, we had at least 100 locations where the newspaper, being the New York War Crimes, which is now its 6th issue, a newspaper that came out of this project, Writers Against the War on Gaza, that is essentially a mock of the New York Times, but speaking out against the New York Times and for Palestinian freedom, and, explaining how those things go hand in hand. So that paper was being distributed across the city and all the boroughs of Staten Island by all these different what we called newsboys, while the printing plant was being blockaded And then at 9 a.m. in Midtown Manhattan, the printing plant is over, Queens. And in Midtown Manhattan at 9 a.m., it's the annual State of the Times, which is this essentially an in-house awards ceremony that the Times holds every year. So it's a day that we know that these workers who often work remotely are coming into the office. And we had hundreds of protesters in the various lobbies of the Midtown Manhattan building on 40th and 41st Street and 8th Ave. And there were over 120 arrests by the NYPD, and they were distributing the New York war crimes to the different people that were arriving for the event. So it was, quite dramatic. And then we also launched this website that Harry and I, helped work on, in which it has these different sections that give legitimacy to our argument that the Times is manufacturing consent for war and is sort of like an arm of U.S. foreign diplomacy, if we want to call it diplomacy, foreign relations, aggression, etc. And so we have some new writing by different Palestinian authors, interviews with different Palestinians and Palestinians that have lived or are living in Gaza, as well as a history section that delves into how the Times has prepared its audience to accept war or regime changes over time. Since the 50s is when we start recording that. And then we also have some archival coverage of the newspapers, as well as this incredible aggregation of data that speaks to that I think Harry can speak to in some detail. But we had people scratch, all of the Times articles since October 7th, and data analysts, work on this. And so what this shows is that we have all these people, journalists, data analysts, artists, all these different media creators that felt that this is absolutely, we need to use every ounce of our ability to stop what's happening in Gaza.
Thank you, Amba. My name is Harry. I'm an educator, writer, and I also organize with Writers Against the War on Gaza and with this project, the New York War Crimes Project. Yeah, so thank you for summarizing the action. I think you did a really good job. To contextualize more so also why the New York Times has been a really important target for us. I mean, part of it is that, we are in New York, we're organizing in New York, so it's a target that makes a lot of sense. But I think we also kind of collectively view the Times as in some senses, like a wing of empire, like an ideological wing. And it's obviously, does not have the direct connection of state media that we see in some other places. But we do understand, and through this historical research that we've done, through the research that we've done since October 7th, that undermining and delegitimizing, destabilizing the Times reputation is really important to undermining empire generally. Like any institution, if we understand ourselves to be against empire, then we have to work to delegitimize the ways that empire reproduces itself, right? So the New York Times is one of those institutions to us. It's arguably one of the most important news outlets in the entire world, largely because when the New York Times prints something, people accept it as fact for the most part. And not just people who read the Times, but people who read other outlets that tail the Times, that will see something printed in the Times and then go re-report that as fact as well. Yeah, so a lot of our work is focused on kind of exposing the ways that the Times is not this unbiased, objective, as one of our comrades says, a repository of objective knowledge. That's not that. It's really a pretty violent tool of ideology that manufactures consent for genocide right now, and in the past has done the same for regime change, for coups across the world, and generally has supported American interests. And we can definitely go into it more, but I think the Times is a really interesting institution to target to, because it conceives of itself in this as this liberal bastion of news, and it kind of understands itself to be very unbiased and presents itself that way. And so it actually tends to be pretty in some instances very subtle and sophisticated in the ways that it understands it has to critique certain things to maintain its legitimacy. Yeah, so we can go into that. But yeah, the Times is a really important target, we think, especially in this current moment, because their coverage since October 7th has been atrocious, in line with how it usually reports, especially on Israel and Palestine. But there's been a couple of specific instances that I can go into that were been pretty bad, and honestly, one of the worst kind of episodes in its history.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you both for that. But you kind of answered this a little bit already in your answers, both of you. But you conducted an interview with Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi, which was published on the website. In it, he discusses reading the New York Times as a form of partisan state media and as a continuous series of insults to our understanding. As he was someone who grew up in a Palestinian household that spoke Arabic, So not only could they understand the local broadcasts, and they also had family in the Middle East, so they knew that what was going on the ground would diverge from what was being widely reported by the New York Times. But Guerguerian also has written for the Times, which I think is an interesting contradiction. In the interview, he articulates the experience working with them, where the editor he was working with sent his op-ed to a fact checker and a proofreader, where he states, and I'm quoting here again, "I got two queries, one about the American weapons deliveries to Israel, in which the fact checker said American weapons were not delivered to Israel until 1973. And I went back to my editor and I listed for him by weapons type, from the A4 Skyhawk to the F4 Phantom to the Hawk anti-aircraft missile, the major weapon systems that were delivered by Israel or to Israel starting in the early 1960s, a decade before 1973. And I said, and I'm quoting Rashidi here, by the way, this man is making a fact sheet. You take him off this story or I'm pulling my piece, and I will not deal with the fantasists of who are putting out some kind of nonsense propaganda in the guise of fact-checking." End quote. So this is, again, a fascinating contradiction to me because on the one hand, it does every now and then allow counter-hegemonic perspectives to be published. The New York Times does. And they have a massive reader base that could be beneficial to mass spreading of information in a progressive, productive way. But on the other hand, it has historically been a net negative, a hindrance to broad historical progress, and it has, in fact, actually been an enemy to racialized and colonized people, internationally speaking. So the interview of the piece with Guerguerian kind of brings up this contradiction to him and asks what do we do in that scenario, right? Do we boycott? But I don't think he actually gave like a straight up, coherent answer, which is also understandable given his position. But basically, I want to ask you both, why the New York Times? Right. And I know you mentioned obviously you're based in New York. So, of course, that's a major reason why you could in your direct proximity to them, of course. But like, again, why New York Times? Why not, other imperialist type newspapers like the Post or whatnot? But also, aside from that, what do you all hope more than anything will come from this project?
Well, I have a few thoughts on that. I'm sure we both do. But yeah, I just want to say a few things. I mean, right, so many of these papers, mainstream news factories have very similar interests, right? They have profit-based interest at the end of the day because they are run by private interest. And that's, maybe some of your listeners know this fact, but, 90% of media, that's every level of media, local media that we see in the U.S. is controlled by one of six giant corporations. The New York Times is not technically, so yeah, they're all, they have negative interests, related to, warmongering, related to the financial interest in a lot of mainstream media is the same as the financial interest of companies like Raytheon and Blackwater, et cetera, right? But the Times does not actually technically fall under that. They call themselves an independent paper. They've been owned by the same family since its founding in the late 1800s in Georgia, in Chattanooga, I believe. So the same family, the Ox-Sulzberger family, has owned the Times for a very long time, and the stock of the New York Times stock is extremely valuable. So not only are they beholden to the interest of this elite family that, for example, is good friends with the Goldmans, Dan Goldman, he's a New York congressperson, and he's I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but he is part of Levi Strauss Foundation. And for example, that's why, the Times, chose them as his pick during the 2022 elections. So they have this elite interest in their family, but also in their shareholders. So there's that. But there's all of these that are like financially interested and like war interested papers. I think the very thing that you mentioned, the fact that like the New York Times does come out with counter hegemonic or counter mainstream or somewhat progressive, challenging narratives to the mainstream is exactly why we're targeting it, because they only do that insofar as that it maintains its elitism, right? Because very much so, the New York Times, more than anyone, is the paper that's supposed to be the paper of elite, and therefore the paper that we do not question, as they say, all the news that's fit to print. So we're in the belly of the beast, like you said, New York, and like New York Times is like the belly of the beast within the belly of the beast. It is where the news that every important person around the world, whether they like the Times or not, reads in the morning. And that's sort of what we're trying to change. I mean, so going into the question about goals, we're hoping to basically steal their legitimacy, right? Take, as inspired by many sort of resistance-based movements, take back, or anti-colonial movements, take back what the colonizing power has taken from you, and to the best of their advantages and use that to win. So we're using their legitimacy, right? People will see, in this instance, the newspaper that's mocked off the New York Times style, or even like see their heading on our website and be intrigued because they know that that is legitimate information. And then, they look further into it and maybe they're questioning why we're questioning them in the first place. And hopefully, they take a moment to sort of read our perspectives. And then I think like with our ideals of where we're going, we all have like huge, ideals, but I think we're all very grounded in, like I said earlier, in any way we can, making Palestinian freedom and the ending of the siege on Gaza to come as fast as possible, to bring about as fast as possible, and doing it with the tools that we have, always inspired by the Palestinian resistance and other resistance movements around the world. Like they have to reappropriate, the tools that have been used against them, and then also work with what they've got in order to continue to fight, whether that's stones or laughter, So Palestinians, and other disenfranchised movements against elite or movements of resistance have to use what they've got. And that's what we're doing. And of course, we're not facing that same fight that they're facing. So it's that we're inspired by them and hoping to borrow some of their tactfulness sometimes. And I think in addition to hoping that we want to delegitimize the New York Times and make people realize that they manufacture war, that what they're doing is very violent, that words have power, and also have people not read the Times as much, I think is a really simple one. Like, realize that there are other voices around you. Every local story they print, whether it's in New York City or in another city in the country, usually has been already reported by a local paper. Like, check out independent news, check out local reporters. And then on the international scale, like, read Middle Eastern news. Like, most of it has an English site, or you can translate in English, or read Russian news, or read Indian news, read the news from wherever you want, read the right, read the left. Like, what is everybody saying, and compare your facts and be an informed reader and support independent journalism, and support journalism that highlights the people that are being oppressed, not the oppressors.
Josh, I think that I just wanted to speak specifically to the point with Rashid where he's talking about how the Times will allow counter-hegemonic narratives, or that you were saying that. I think we're actually watching this play out kind of in live time right now. I think it's become pretty clear, even to like the Biden White House, to a lot of congressional Democrats. I mean, someone like Chuck Schumer has like pretty outspokenly criticized Netanyahu recently, that this war is becoming like politically toxic. Like it's no longer something that like the American empire is like seeing as something that is bearing any more fruit, right? It's just, at this point, it's just like slaughter. In their eyes, it seems to be that way. Obviously, they're still doing, Biden's still approving weapons deals, and he's still like sanctioning the starvation of Gaza, but rhetorically, at least, they're changing this. And I think that there's been a really marked shift in the Times coverage in the past few weeks, where they're starting to understand that in order to maintain like the legitimacy of empire at large, of the U.S. kind of global order, of Israel as a state, they have to allow some criticism in, and they have to find things that they can be critical of. So they've been, there's been criticism slowly trickling in of Netanyahu, and of being like, oh, he's this right-wing fundamentalist, and that's why this war has gotten so bad, right? Which kind of deflects away from the core issue, which is that Israel is a settler colonial state that's founded on violence, that is going to continue to perpetuate violence against Palestinians until we free Palestine. And I think it's very emblematic of how the Times understands, is like very self-aware often of what kinds of criticisms it needs to let in order to like legitimize the broader project. So you'll see this, I mean, even in criticizing, looking back at like wars in Iraq, or looking back at the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011, they will allow these smaller critiques that are more so focused on tactics, right? Like, oh, we messed up in Iraq because we didn't do X and X, as opposed to like, why does the U.S. have the right to invade Iraq at all? Which is not the kind of question or critique that you'll see in the Times. So like letting in those critiques is actually really important for them, for their coverage, to in a broader sense legitimize the entire project of like U.S. empire.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads us to like our next point. I'm thinking about the more specific research you guys embarked on. So in the history section on the New York war crimes website, it is noted in the middle how, and I'm quoting here, an interrogation of the New York Times archive reveals a sordid history, a record of support for American wars, right-wing dictatorships, and U.S.-backed regime change, end quote. And so there you see sections from Iraq in 2003, Brazil in 1964, Libya in 2011, Iran 1953, Bolivia in 2019, Venezuela in 2019, Guatemala in 1954, and Cuba in 2021. And if you click on any of these sections, an article pops up exposing the incredibly egregious reporting that was done by the Times in an attempt to manufacture consent for colonial imperial conquest. And so you guys show how in almost every single instance in the reporting on geopolitical issues in or conflict in other imperialized nations, the Times was almost exclusively clumsy in their reporting, oftentimes relying on anonymous U.S. government officials and defectors, as is in the case of Iraq in 2003. And of course, this is only a fraction, the deliberate egregiousness regarding the reporting and its 170-year history. But discuss some of these instances that you all focused on and why these in particular.
Yeah, so I think the genesis of the history section and why we think it's important, and Amba and I have both worked on this section a lot, so we were pretty in deep on the archives and such, is that we are trying to make, as a project, the whole New York War Crimes Project, we're trying to make a systematic case against the Times, right? We don't want it to just be kind of like how people think about, for instance, the reporting on Iraq in 2003. The narrative is often that there was this one reporter, Judith Miller, who had bad sourcing and was kind of rogue and was going after getting these big scoops. And in so doing, she kind of inadvertently, helped the Bush administration manufacture a pretext to invade Iraq with WMDs and the connections to Al-Qaeda and so on. That's often the narrative around, kind of bad reporting that's shoddy, that the reporting is done poorly, which is often true. But we were trying to make the case that this is a systemic issue within the Times, that when you can go back and look at any instance in the history of U.S. empire, particularly after World War II, and you will see the Times on the sideline or actively involved, with Iraq or with Libya, cheering it on and making it happen. Whether it's regime change, whether it's a coup, whether it's an attempted coup, whether it's a war, this is something that you can go back and trace. And yeah, some of the examples that we did, so again, Iraq is a really, probably their most famously bad episode, infamous episode. But there are a lot of other ones that people don't know so much about. I think even in doing the research on the buildup to the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011 was fascinating, because it wasn't a history I knew super well, but they did just as much as they did in Iraq to build a pretext. They told a ton of lies based on, really no evidence, because they were trying to portray Gaddafi in a certain way because they wanted to help build the pretext for NATO to intervene in Libya. In the Libya example is also really emblematic because it includes a lot of the kind of through lines that go through all of their historical coverage, which is, A, they're going to provide you with certain context that is useful for the U.S. war machine, for the U.S. empire, and they're going to invisibilize context that isn't useful. When they were talking about Gaddafi, the whole narrative in the build-up to Libya was Gaddafi is about to commit a genocide against the Libyan people. The U.S. is going to intervene for humanitarian reasons, and that's the end of the story, right? They're not going to tell you anything about how Gaddafi was, played a role in organizing against Africa in Libya and on the African continent. They're not going to tell you about oil interests, which obviously have been a big part of the story in Libya and Iraq. But they will give you context and try to paint Gaddafi in a certain way. So, yeah, that one's really indicative. Today is the 60th anniversary of the coup in Brazil in 1964, which is, another example where the Times is just openly celebrating a military junta that's taking power. But yeah, I recommend if people are listening to this to go take a look at all the historical episodes. We hope that they're pretty damning in how they portray the Times. And there's a lot more to look into as well. We're hoping to produce some more, little historical articles about different moments in history, because there are many, many more times when they've done this. But these ones that we picked, I think, cover a wide range of, coups, regime change, war, attempted coups, sanctions. So they give you a pretty decent picture of how the Times works in that sense.
Yeah, and I have to shout out Harry, because he really was the one who got in there and began to dig. And so, bravo, Harry, because he's the one who brought us Iraq 2003, Brazil 1964, Libya 2011, Iran 1953, Bolivia 2019, Venezuela 2019, Guatemala 54, and Cuba 21. And I think the there's only more. Like for every, it seems to be pretty consistent. And what I found like editing this, that in every conflict, the Times, in line in this case with both like the, whether it's the president and or the CIA and like different branches of the US government, time and time again, which is pretty damning. But not only do they do that, do they like at the end of the day, does their reporting support their line? They have used now since the 50s, right? The first one we looked at was Iran, 1953. The same exact sort of arguments and sometimes really shoddy, sort of statements, shoddy meaning they're reporting to make like really like sweeping claims. Like it is evident that this was the good thing for the Venezuelan people, for the Bolivian people, for the Iranian people, that they wanted, their leader gone. That's always the case. This is what the people wanted, right? Even though factually sometimes it's not the case. And that it's a step in the right direction. That it's a step in the right direction toward democracy. And that even when it's a coup, that it was democratic, right? They maintain that because the Times wants to maintain it as its essence that it is a bastion of democracy, right? Morality. And and so therefore this all happens under, the guise of democracy. And yeah, I mean, it's just like nothing has changed. Nothing has changed from what we started in the 50s to now, I would say. And I think what's something that is important to add here is that the Times does sometimes have a good scoop, right? We're not saying the Times never has a good scoop, or it's like made up of like only bad reporters. We're saying that they like do it within a context and within a narrative. They report in a way that is not objective, and they act that they are objective, when in reality everybody has biases. So it's much better if you just state them at the outset and let your readers like naturally, decide what they want with your information with that stated bias.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's like very crucial here in like and which is why I asked the question about the contradictions of like, there's simply a reason why they have the kind of prestige that they have, right? Like publicly, almost universally recognized as like, this like incredible institution that has produced a lot of great writing, a lot of great reporting and things like that. And so like, what I'm interested in is like this, which is why I'm fascinated by the project that you guys embarked on, is that there is like this dire need to demystify it as well. Because I see this from people on the left as well, like I guess even like the professional leftists in a sense, where like there's still this level of like desire to one day be published by the New York Times. And also I've seen people reluctant to even critique it in a harsh way because of that, because like, they have friends that work for it, or they see it as like something that they will potentially, have a relationship to, I guess you can say. And so I just find it really fascinating that like, that this is something that has been done or is being done. And I think it's like necessary for sure. But yeah, so if you guys don't have anything to add to that, I would totally move on to the next one.
Yeah, all I would add is that it very comically have been accused oftentimes online by people in person of just wanting to further our own careers so that we can write for the Times, which is always
right.
It kind of, I think sometimes people are projecting a little bit when they say things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
No, I was just thinking because I think there is like this like something I think about quite often is how little people read even like blogs and stuff. Like I'm thinking about like if people don't see like a name that they recognize with like the website title, they're not going to click on it, a good part of it. And I think about this app because I know of like different like spots like the Hood Communist, for example, does really good work. And there's a couple others as well, like left-leaning, like independent publications who like are, doing like op-eds, but also like doing reporting and things like that, or historical analyses as well, and doing it just as like efficiently and just as like rigorously as the New York Times does it their own, right? But don't have the resources for it. But I think that like there is like this need to shit on the name of the New York Times, if that makes sense. I guess like make it, I guess, universally known that like this is not the end all be all when it comes to great writing or great journalism. That makes sense. But yeah.
Yeah, we want to change it so that people become ashamed to say that they work for the New York Times. Like, we live in a society where, like, we are, like, nowhere as far as, like, ending, like, the police state, right? But, like, it's a little bit, like, shameful to say you're a cop now. Like, that's just, like, the tip of the iceberg is for people to, like, there should begin to be some shame associated with the Times. Absolutely. And for that, too, and maybe I'll plug this again at the end, which I forgot to mention at the beginning, it's like, we do have an ask of everyone, which is to unsubscribe from the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, again, like I said, you could find your news elsewhere. I challenge you to find your news elsewhere, and I bet you will find, better variety and some incredible local and independent written stories. You could read the Indypendent, the newspaper I work for. It's Independent with a Y, but and the New York War Crimes, and you can listen to this podcast and unsubscribe. And if you need to check the Times every once in a while, that's fine. Like 10 of your friends can share one account, okay? But like we are trying to smear their name a bit with good reason, and they have blood on their hands. I mean, check out the book. We'll explain why.
Of course. Yeah. So, but that kind of gets us to our next question, because I think this is probably the most relevant and important in the current moment. But let's discuss some of the reporting you have observed from most recently, specifically as it relates to what has been reported surrounding the ongoing massacre of Palestinians for the past 5 months or so. And I think the thing I've been most disturbed with is the framing of the genocide as a war between Hamas and Israel. And obviously the Post has done this just as much as well, but it's just the outright pretending that these are two entities that are comparable in scale or scope in any remote way, of course. So just what have you all observed from this? What have you all documented? And how does this relate to the kind of historical archival work you've been doing as well?
Yeah, we've observed a lot. It's been 6 months now? So almost 6 months. So there's been a lot of horrible reporting, and a lot of reporting that is like pretty explicitly geared towards justifying this ongoing genocide. I think the most famous instance that's happened in the past few months, since October 7th, is the story that they put out in December called Screams Without Words. And I believe the subtitle is How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th. So this is a story that they put out, and the claim in the story is that Hamas systematized mass rape on October 7th and used it as a weapon of war. Very quickly, the New York War Crimes, this newspaper that we're talking about, that we're part of, collaborated with a group called the Feminist Solidarity Network for Palestine to very quickly write a long rebuttal, in-depth rebuttal of this piece that's also on the website. But basically, this piece is just reported in every single way possible as just a disaster from a journalistic standpoint. And it was reported by a former Israeli military intelligence officer who had no journalism experience beforehand, and her nephew, who's like a food reporter. And they, for some reason, were tasked by the Times to do all the evidence gathering on this case. And they, it's disgusting. It's like truly a gross piece of journalism that has been debunked at every stage. There still is not evidence that there was any kind of systematized campaign of mass rape by Hamas. But more importantly, they put out this report at a time when the war and the genocide was beginning to get a lot less popular, or not a lot less popular, but it was becoming more contentious, right, in December. And the timing of it was so obvious that they were looking for a way to reinvigorate the war effort and to get people behind it by, doing this like atrocity propaganda. Like, well, how could you support Hamas? Have you seen what they've done? So that's, I think that's, along with another story about this group called Zaka, Zaka, which is an Israeli group that did a lot of the collection of bodies after October 7th. That was also turned out to be all of the people involved in that are
whose founder is imperial rapist.
Yes, and they're also just been spreading lies, like just very blatantly. They've these have all come unraveled. So that's like kind of the more spectacular, really, really just gross propaganda that the Times has been doing, which isn't really important to point out for a lot of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons is that, like we were saying, everyone assumes that what the Times prints is true, and this is a really good example of like they did this massive story that they claimed had all these witnesses and all these interviews and all this evidence, and it's just complete bullshit. But that's not the only thing, right? I think that there's been also really strong patterns of coverage. Like we did a pretty big data aggregation project, which the people who worked on are fantastic and wonderful, and we love them. And, we found some things like, for instance, since October 7th, and this is up until March, I believe, when we published the website, the Times, they're reporting on his anti-Semitism like 5 times as much as they're reporting on Islamophobia. They're quoting I think they quoted more U.S. officials than Palestinians in total. Israeli and Americans are being cited at way, way higher rates than Palestinians. They're talking about Israelis more, even when 25 times as many people have died in Gaza. Palestinians have died. All these things. So if you look on the website, there's lots of great data aggregation that we did, and there's also other people have done this work looking at the language. Right, they intercepted an interesting study where they found that all the the LA Times and New York Times and the Post, all of them the language that they use, for instance, to describe Palestinians dying is very different than the language they use to describe Israelis dying. Israelis are always dying in a slaughter, a massacre. It's a horrific event. And that language, the language for Palestinians, is extremely calm and just like rote, normal. They're just dying.
A bullet came from somewhere and killed the man.
They wrote an article about a Lebanese journalist, I believe, that was killed by Israel. And they said that he was killed by a missile that was fired from the direction of Israel, which is kind of, one of the more egregious cases, but is indicative of how they do a lot of this stuff. But anyways, so there's like that kind of stuff that we found. And there's also, it's almost, we could talk for an hour and a half, 2 hours about just their coverage since October 7th. But I think one of the things that's been most notable recently, and that's really indicative of how they talk about these things, is their coverage of famine in Gaza. So as I'm sure most people know, there are children dying every day of malnutrition in Gaza. There are, I'm sure, going to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of kids that are going to have permanent health issues because of the past few months of being completely deprived from nutrients. It's horrifying. And even Western NGOs like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, everyone at the UN is saying Israel, like very specifically, I think Amnesty said Israel is engineering a famine, right? All these groups, even these Western NGOs, are saying Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. This is a clear tactic that they're using to starve the Palestinian people in Gaza because they're trying to win this war. They're trying to punish the people in Gaza. And the New York Times has continued to write these articles where they wrote an article a week ago or 2 weeks ago that was, the headline was, "Why isn't more aid getting to Gazans?" And they go through all these things where they're like, oh, the convoys keep getting attacked by these mobs of Palestinians. And it's really hard to get stuff through from this angle because Hamas is there. And they never, they just never address the fact that there's a widespread condemnation of Israel for starving Gaza. It's actually kind of remarkable. But I think the past few weeks of their coverage on that has been really indicative of how they invisibilize Israel as an actor, as people, as a country that has agency, a state that has agency and is using it to commit war crimes. Instead, they present it as this kind of like this grand tragedy that so many people are starving in Gaza. But I think that in particular, and there are so many other instances and things that we could talk about, but that one has been really kind of emblematic of how they erase Israel's crimes, and they turn this, especially recently, into this kind of this grand tragedy that is unclear why it's happening, but it's so sad. But none of the blame is going to go to Israel.
Right. And I just want to add a couple notes there. I think one thing too that's really frustrating is like the way that information is presented by the Times is somewhat problematic, right? Like they reference these documents that they saw, or video that they saw, something they read, something they were told, and don't provide any proof. And I think that goes along with them being like thought of as the paper of record. They're not. They've passed an era where they like source their information well, and sometimes what's behind that is something that was looked at by a reporter and something that is really true and did really happen. And sometimes it's not. And there's been holes poked in that now. And I think that's really important for us to consider as like recipients of information, as everyday people. Like, are we okay with someone just deciding that they're the voice of God, right? Or do we want a reporter to say like, maybe give us a link to what you're looking at? That's possible. And in some of these cases, sure, it's like you're describing like violent rape. Like, well, I'm not saying you need to show that to everybody, but in some of these cases, it's not. And still, it's always the Times said or the Times saw. And as you said before, so often and very much so lately, are their sources soldiers? And like that in itself, there's a problem with. Like, it's okay to speak to, a soldier or military person every once in a while when we're dealing with foreign conflict, but like they should not be the bulk, and definitely not the bulk, more than one of the sides of that conflict if we are seeing it as a conflict, but definitely shouldn't even be the bulk of the voice of one side, right? Like we can't be always quoting the military. Like there's a reason we don't quote the cops, right, all the time. Like it's kind of ridiculous. But I think like one thing I'll say is they came out with this, this story on March 26th by clearly we're taking cues of criticism of the Screams Against War, how Hamas weaponized sexual violence story. we're taking cues from the criticism of that. It's clear in the way they wrote it, the way they sourced it, and the fact that it's written by Patrick Kinsley, who is the Jerusalem, chief of the Jerusalem Bureau, and the Rowan Barkman, who's done a lot of, Middle East reporting. So,
also a former IDF soldier.
Of course. Well, when we're talking about that, something I wanted to mention earlier too, like side note, like it's not easy to delegitimize the Times. Like, how many of them, right, have direct ties, if not were members of the IDF? How many of them have like direct ties to like, companies that promote and make so much money off of Zionist like settlers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. How many of them, live in homes that belong to Palestinians? That's a joke we make. Anyway, but going on in this article, right? So in this article that came out on March 26th, Israeli hostage says she was sexually assaulted and tortured in Gaza. There are some damning facts here. And again, like, we're not denying, nor is like most people who've like taken the time to deeply research that sexual violence was likely used on October 7th, but it wasn't used in a systematized way as it has been like purported. And I think I would suggest all of your listeners to watch the October 7th documentary by Al Jazeera that came out last week. It's on YouTube. It's really good. They went and did a deep dive investigation into October 7th. And, what they found was the same thing that the UN found, was that there were probably some instances of sexual violence that happened on October 7th at the hands of Hamas and sometimes Palestinians that came in through the opening in the fence, in the hours and days that followed. But but it wasn't systematized at all. It happened insofar as it happens when men and guns go and, wreak havoc on places. Now, this March 26th article is a story of a hostage who allegedly was forced to allegedly do a sexual act on one of her Hamas captors. But there's this line in it where they say, and I think this sort of just really like sums up the New York Times whole sort of like the whole framing of everything and like how they couch everything in this like liberal Zionism. They say that Israeli strikes on the neighborhood became more frequent and frightening. Mr. Dana, who's, the character in the story, said, the primary source, noting that some shattered the windows. As the bombing intensified, she said, she started feeling sorry for the civilians, wondering why Hamas had never built bomb shelters for its people. So it's like, immediately in that one sentence, we're taking away the fault of the bombing or its effect on people, on Israel, and putting it on Hamas.
Yeah, pretty common thing that they do is blaming Hamas for civilian casualties, or even implying that Hamas wants there to be high civilian casualties is something they do commonly. And then I also just wanted to close with on this specifically with one other anecdote or example, which I think is really telling. The Times is a place that purports itself to really care about journalism, like as a practice, and journalists specifically. Like if you look back at their coverage when Jamal Khashoggi was killed in Saudi Arabia, it was on the front page like many times. They like to present themselves as a place that cares about journalism. I think close to 140 journalists, almost entirely Palestinian, have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. They have not paid attention to this at all. They have written, occasionally they write stories where there will be a paragraph that appears in there that is like, the Committee to Protect Journalists says that X amount of journalists have died since October 7th. They do not blame Israel. They do not tell you that Israel has been systematically targeting journalists. They do not tell you that all of these journalists are Palestinian except for one or two, and the other ones are Lebanese, or a couple are Israeli that died on October 7th. It's been an egregious oversight. It's been almost 6 months. They still have not written, that I'm aware of, and I'm almost positive about this, a large-scale investigation into this is the most deadly conflict for journalists in modern history. It is clear that one side of the conflict is targeting journalists and killing them in a place where they also will not allow foreign journalists into. It's quite remarkable. And it's not surprising to us, but for the Times to not even acknowledge this in a serious way or investigate it in a serious way is just so, and to me, it's incredibly damning. It's really bad.
Right. I mean, that's the other problem too, is like, that's what when they do report on something that isn't within their narrative, it's off to the side, right? It's a graph, a note, right? Some of the notes,
12th paragraph.
Yeah, some of the notes that they put about how the Screams Without Words article, they didn't make any announcement to, anybody. It wasn't even a note at the end about how it was poorly reported, how the video around which the whole article was built was debunked. They just put it in what did they put it in? Not in parentheses. whatever. They put it in brackets. That's it. They just put it in brackets in the middle of the article. It's the same thing with their morning. If you get their newsletter, I mean, it's terrible. I've been getting it since October 7th just to track it. It's like, if there's no longer any breaking news since at least the new year about, the genocide or the, as they call it, the Israel-Hamas war. And if there is, it is only in regards to the Israelis being the victims, right? And if some breaking thing happens, like the Flower Massacre, where so many Palestinians in the north of Gaza were killed for collecting aid that had finally come, killed by the Israeli army, they'll do it hours later and say, oh, it may have been a stampede. So you either don't get this breaking news about the Palestinians. If you do, it was so breaking that everyone else in the world reported on it. And so they had to, in order to maintain that elitism and like some sense of objectivity, report on it, but they don't report on these things. They don't report on the journalists dying.
Yeah, I guess one last thing. For the Flower Massacre, this was their headline after Israel murdered at least 100 Palestinians who were trying to access aid in a place that Israel has been depriving of food and starving people. The headline read, "As hungry Gazans crowd a convoy, a crush of bodies, Israeli gunshots, and a deadly toll." So this is pretty indicative of the way that they obscure intent, they obscure the ways in which Israeli leaders have consistently said that they're trying to commit a genocide since October 7th. Out loud, the defense minister, the prime minister, the president, everyone. This headline just is like, you have no idea what's going on. You get this sense that there was chaos and then, some people died somehow, which is kind of the general sense that you've gotten from this entire war. If you're reading the Times, it's that there's been some tragedies and like, who knows who's responsible, but it's definitely Hamas if anyone's responsible. Anyways, yeah, right. I think Amba and I could probably talk about this for 10 to 15 hours.
No, but this same thing, but that doesn't make me think, last comment, and we're running out of time here, but it's like with the Shifa raid right now, or that happened in the last 2 weeks, I guess, the last 10 days, I can't even track anything.
Ben, I think today's day 11 or 12, yeah.
Day 11. Okay, so and very similar, right? Like similar killings around the Kuwaiti roundabout. There, people are waiting for aid finally, and then like that's when they get killed in mass. This is not like the Flower Massacre was not. There was not only one Flower Massacre, shall I say? That one was the most, ugly because there was blood all over the flower. People get killed waiting for aid all the time. Also, there's been like many claims of rape and sexual violence against Palestinian women at the hand of Israeli soldiers throughout the course of this siege and genocide, but especially at Shifa, during the siege on Shifa that happened, nearly 2 weeks ago. And there's been no muttering of anything from the New York Times or any mainstream outlet that there were claims. They could just say there's claims. Of course, they can't be investigated because they're not allowed in there, but they haven't reported on that either.
Yeah, so I was really interested in this because in Harry and I's private conversation, it was sound like the archival research stuff you guys are doing was really fascinating. But with you guys being so in depth with the history of the New York Times, colonial imperial apologetics, and serving as a mouthpiece for U.S. empires, wars, and conquests for nearly 2 centuries now, I would just love to hear you discuss, how do you see a pathway forward, right? How do you advise people to engage or don't with the paper? How do you recommend progressive-minded people discuss these things with their family and friends who see the NYT or the New York Times as a reputable and reliable and progressive institution? And how should scholars, public intellectuals, types engage with it as well? Right? Should they publish their work with the paper? And what steps could be taken to find alternative media that is not just a regurgitation of whatever the State Department is saying?
Well, we're asking people to BDU. So boycott, divest, and unsubscribe from the Times. So boycotting can look like not writing for them or if you're a writer. That's definitely something we're suggesting people do. Take your work elsewhere if you can. I mean, we're not saying like if you get all of your money from the Times, quit your job. Well, actually, we are saying quit your job. That's definitely something we're saying. And if you can't, like, provide us information if you're not ready to quit your job. Like, find out people who, if you're unhappy there, reach out to us. Our information is everywhere, but it's wawag_now, on social media, or you can go to the Wawag website, leak us information, quit your job, divest, any money that you have in them, whether it's your subscription or, stock interest or what. And, we can compile, I think we've talked about compiling, other sources to look. But for now, like, I would just say, like, look for independent media. Independent media is a great keyword to use, I would say, to like find something in the locale where you're looking. Follow all these Palestinian journalists, follow Palestinian news outlets. You can follow, like, for Greater Middle Eastern Independent Journalism, Madamasr, MADAMASR is really good. That comes out of Egypt, but covers a lot of general Middle Eastern resistance, space politics. The list goes on. But yeah, unsubscribe from the New York Times, stop supporting them financially, get other people to unsubscribe from them, find your news elsewhere. It's like, don't feel like terrible for taking in corporate media. We have to. We also need to know, like, it's important to stay informed on what the mainstream narrative is so that we can challenge it. Well, I think it's time to like break this apart and understand that it is a weapon. The news has been perceived as a weapon by oppressors and resistors forever, right? Like the Bolshevik Revolution, many say, wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the press. It was the press got during the Bolshevik Revolution, taken apart in different pieces and stored in different places because it was extremely relevant and extremely necessary to not be taken and confiscated. So I think it's important to just remember that news and words are tools and are powerful. And like, while it might not be realistic or helpful for us to engage in any sort of like violence-based resistance here in the States, it's really not our role. I think to understand that words and news as weapons is the most important thing I can ask, and can also be a harbinger of resistance, hope, peace, etc.
Yeah, I did want to speak to connect it kind of to the question of how we talk to our families, maybe.
Yes,
or talk
please.
to people in our life. I think that, the New York Times, I grew up in a household that was, kind of like, I have like professional class parents, like Northeastern white household. And the New York Times was like the Bible. Like the New York Times, it shows up on our porch every morning. You read the front page even when I was like, 8, 9 years old. And it's kind of like, this is what is happening in the world today. This is what is important. I have a very distinct memory of coming downstairs on May 1st, 2011. And my dad put the paper and did the the front page of the New York Times in front of me. And he was like, you're going to remember this day for the rest of your life. And it was the day that bin Laden was killed, which is not a day I'm going to remember for the rest of my life, except for the fact that my dad told me to. But, even like I remember, I remember following, like, is actually one of the reasons that doing the research on Libya was so interesting to me was because I remember following the build up to that war in the New York Times when I was 11 years old. Like I remember believing everything that I was reading and being like, oh, this guy is a dictator that's about to kill everyone who lives in his country. We need to get in there. Like, we need to go intervene. And I'm like an 11-year-old, right? And I'm thinking this. This stuff is really powerful when everyone around you tells you that it is the Bible, when everyone says that, and everyone knows that the New York Times is this like fount of objective information. It can be very dangerous, right? And it's an extremely important legitimizing institution for the U.S.'s goals around the world. We didn't really get to talk about this a lot, but even like the recent coverage, some of the examples that we went through in Cuba, Venezuela, and Bolivia in the past 5 years, they've done a lot of work to support people who are opposing regimes that are enemies of the U.S. And they do a lot of work to convince you as the reader that if the Cuban government is an enemy of the U.S., that means that they're an existential threat to you, and you need to worry about this is really important to you to care about Cuban government being overthrown. Or in Bolivia, when they were presenting this like really bullshit OAS report about the Bolivian election being fraudulent, they were trying to get you to convince you to think that Evo Morales being in power is really important to you, and is important to you because it's scary and dangerous, and you can't have a socialist in power in Bolivia because that's where the lithium is. So I'm rambling a little bit, but I think what the point I'm trying to get at is that undercutting this kind of authoritativeness of the Times, and not just the Times, but all of U.S. media that trails the Times too, U.S. kind of mainstream media, is like incredibly important in undercutting the general narrative that the U.S. empire tries to sell of itself, of being this kind of benevolent superpower that's interested in humanitarian reasons and, protecting global trade or whatever. A huge part of undoing that mythology and getting people to see beyond it, to understand that the U.S. is a very violent empire that does what it does for very self-interested reasons, and because it wants to protect profits that are accruing to global capitalists is undercutting and delegitimizing the sources of information that tell us that support those narratives. So that the Times is really important in that way. I think our broader goal is to delegitimize it, is to make it so that people don't look at the Times as the paper of record, that they look at it as a place that is, doing the work of the State Department for the most part.
Right. And speaking of that, I'll share an anecdote. For my family, it's not been the same. We never held the Times. We never read the Times. My dad's family is, we're Arab, we're Middle Eastern, and so the Times was a disgrace. But one of my uncles did become, I won't say which one, obviously. One of my uncles on either of my sides became a diplomat, and an uncle-in-law, actually. And he was not American. So everyone was like, how did you become a diplomat? Like a U.S. diplomat? That's pretty crazy. And he was just like, I read the Times every day for like 4 years. So I think that kind of it says it in a nutshell.
Yeah,
sure.
It definitely does, for sure. And honestly, it kind of reminds me a little bit of, I think it was the interview, because I read a couple of things from the website, so I don't remember exactly where I saw this, but I think it was the Greene interview where he speaks about how the differences between state media in different contexts, because most countries, maybe not most, but a lot of countries have a form of state media, right? But the difference between that with this context is that people don't recognize the New York Times as state media, right? That's something reserved for dictatorships, right? Which we know is a racialized term in and of itself.
Right.
And so I do think it's interesting though, that distinguishing, right, between and how the New York Times has been able to almost maintain a level of plausible deniability in a sense, right? Where because it houses, like we mentioned earlier, the counter-hegemonic viewpoints and things like that. And at times it contradicts its own even reporting, And so with that being said, there's I think this is the type of work that I don't think we have to continue advancing forward because of that reality that we have to demystify the institution in itself, right? As it currently exists, as just prestigious and reputable and widely acceptable organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for talking to us about this.
Before we let you go, tell folks where they can reach you, where they can support your work, and then also what else you guys have on the docket for what comes next.
You can reach out to this project, the New York War Crimes. I think you can DM us on Twitter would probably be the best way.
Yes, Twitter is...
Also on Twitter, what's our handle, Carrie?
It is NY War Crimes, and the website is New York, spelled out, NewYorkWarCrimes.com.
Yeah, NEWYORK, warcrimes.com. And so you can reach us there. You can also, if you want to reach out to me, I'm trying to think of a good way to reach out to me. You can email me. My email is amba.independent@gmail.com. AMBA _independent. That's independent, but the first E, make it a Y, @gmail.com. If you want to get involved in, learning more about any of this or independent media, wherever you are, or getting involved in this project, please reach out. And you boycott, divest, unsubscribe.
Boycott, divest, unsubscribe. Free Palestine. Fuck Thomas Friedman.
Free Palestine.
Absolutely.
Bye.